For those who don't know me, I am Katharine Lusk. I'm Executive Director of the Video Initiative on Cities. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the panel. It's also a pleasure to be part of hosting you all for the duration of the day. I'm going to very briefly introduce the panel because you know a lot about what we're going to talk about, but you don't know as much about who they are. And it's a great group of people. So starting all the way on the left, we have Katherine, Levine, Einstein. Katie, Professor Einstein, is an assistant professor of political science. She's an incredibly popular teacher and professor here at BU. I work with her frequently as well because she is the co-principal investigator on the Medina Survey of Mayors, which is a big project we run annually, interviewing mayors across the country around a range of policy priorities and challenges. She is joined by, we haven't met yet, Matt Hoover, I presume?
Yes.
Okay. Matt is a data scientist with Gallup, where he consults for enterprise and government clients and develops predictive models and forecasts. And we're really delighted to hear about some of the work they've done bringing their perception and sort of value research to Boston. And then Jaclyn Youngblood, who's a program director with the Boston Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics, where she focuses on operations and systems prototypes related to education, food access, and public safety. And I apologize, Gosha, because I don't have your bio. I wasn't sure that both of you were speaking. So forgive me for that.
No worries.
And then also Kim Lucas, who's the director of civic research for the Boston Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics, who seeks to pair research and practice to seek real solutions to social policy and planning problems. She's also presently a PhD candidate in social policy and sociology at Brandeis. Thank you. I'm going to let Gosha and Kim take it away. We'll go through presentations, and then I'll start us off with a couple questions, and then open it up to Q&A. The one last thing I wanted to add is that I've asked all of these guys to really think about what their project teaches us about inequality, but also what it teaches us about with regard to inequality and civic engagement. So who are we engaging? Who are we speaking to? Who are we hearing from? And what voices may we actually be overlooking? So how do their respective projects, which actually run from a range of topics, how do they teach us and instruct us into what more we need to be doing to be more inclusive, to reduce inequality, and reduce barriers to access to government, and ensure that everyone's voices are heard? Thank you.
Great. Ready to kick it off? All right.
Yeah, since I didn't get a bio, I can give my own bio. Great. So my name is Gosha Tomaszewska. I'm the program manager for Boston Saves. Very new to Boston Saves, about 4 months, but not very new to the field of asset building in Boston and kind of throughout the state and kind of on a national level. So I'm really excited to be here and kind of share some of my learnings from Boston Saves in the last few months. So Boston Saves is a children's savings account program.
Oh, I got it.
It's a children's savings account program, and because Kim started it, it's research and evidence-based. As you can see, low and moderate children with as little as 500 are 3 times as likely to go to college and 4 times as likely to graduate. So kind of that's the basis. Boston Saves is one of several children's savings accounts in Boston. The Treasury, the Massachusetts Treasury, has 2 different pilots going on, and a nonprofit in Versant. I'm not quite sure if I'm forgetting somebody else, but yeah, it's kind of a growing movement within Massachusetts and nationally. I think currently there are around 382,000 accounts, and especially compared to the work I was doing before in asset building, I think children's savings accounts are a lot more scalable because you can reach a lot of people. At a very kind of basic level when they're young, versus what I was doing before, individual development accounts. You kind of help people when they're older, but it's harder to reach as many people because they're in different places. A little bit more about Boston Saves. We're currently 11 Boston public schools. Throughout the schools, there are around 1,000 students that are in the pilot currently. All of the kids get a $50 seed, and then receive different incentives throughout the 12 years in the project. My job, as Kim likes to point out, is to take it to scale. So there's another pilot year next year, and then from there we're going to all BPS schools, so 82 schools by 2019. And so in addition to the savings, I think the one thing that we're really focusing on is creating a kind of college-going and just kind of post-secondary education, because it's not just college, it's really for career training and really giving kids the anchor of knowing that they will be able to go to college or have some kind of career training. So, and as part of Boston Saves, Kim has dreamt up Family Champions, so let her talk a little bit more about that, and then we'll share some learning.
Cool. So as Gosha talked about, Gosha is here to take Boston Saves to scale. I kicked off Boston Saves by working on the design process and really kickstarting the pilot of the program. Our pilot is a 3-year pilot, and really it's because, first of all, the government is doing this, right? Like, let's not be fooled. We are part of the government, and we're doing this program about financial empowerment, which is a really sensitive subject, even when you're talking with like little kids and 5-year-olds. It's a very sensitive issue. And so I wanted to take the time and care to be able to craft a program that people actually want and people actually, that works for people and addresses the things that they need. One of the things that so this is actually the 3 pilot years is actually a set of different experiments that we're doing to make sure that the program that we're doing in Boston isn't some cookie-cutter program that we're lifting up from another city and plopping down here, but instead creating a Boston program that's tailored to the needs of Boston families. So here's some things we've learned from our design phase and from our first couple of years during the pilot. First of all, when we present something like this to families, they're excited, they're engaged, they're enthusiastic. They have 5-year-olds, and that's like the perfect time to begin talking about saving for the future, because the future is far off, but we can see in our small 5-year-old self who they want to be and who they could become. So that's really exciting for us. 2, something else that we've learned is that when families see themselves and their communities in the program, when they see themselves reflected as part of the program, that's what gets them excited, right? So it's not just about the future, it's not just about their individual child, but guess what? Like, I actually see people like myself doing this. I actually see people in my community buying into this and like thinking this is a good idea, and that makes me then want to participate. And so that's exciting for us too. So I have 2 big learnings from our first couple of years that I'll highlight. Here's the challenge, though, is that we are a citywide program. We're going to, Gosha is going to take this to 84 schools, and we're presently only in 11 schools. And even in 11 schools, the things that we've learned in terms of the shapes and sizes and wants and needs and what the pain points of families are when it comes to saving, they're all on board. So how do I take the standardized program that we're delivering to all students, all 84 public schools with kindergarten? How do I take this and bring it, tailor it to all of the wants and needs of different families? That's our challenge. And in our second year, this year, of our pilot, we decided that one way that we might experiment with this is to think through what we call family champions. Family champions this year were hand-selected by our 11 participating schools. So I asked our school leaders, we have school champions who are all on board. Hopefully that didn't mess up with the mic. Our school champions who are already on board at each of our schools. And we talked to our school champions and said, hey, we get that you are running your schools and you have one kind of role in your schools, but families play another kind of role in your schools. Do you have amazing families who you would recommend to be a family champion? And guess what? They don't even have to have kids participating in our program. They just have to be excited about bringing this to your school. We've brought together, from those recommendations, a range of folks who have come from different schools, and for the last 4 months, and going into our 4th month this coming May, we'll be looking at different ways to bring them together, give them different kinds of resources that the city provides, and the question then becomes, what happens, right? So what happens, our experiment really hinges on the question, what happens when a government doing this kind of program steps back and instead of centering us and our program, we center the families and say, hey, families, you know something we don't know. You know something about working in your schools that we don't know. You know something about being a parent in your schools that we don't know. Please share with one another. Please share with us. And what we can do is step back and provide supportive resources to you. When I say, oh, I wish I had. So for our example, we have one family who said, this is a great program, but I wish, and I love the whole post-secondary message for my child. I wish I had access to some kind of post-secondary resources. And then we're like, oh, yes, okay, we have those. Here they are. Now, what do you want to do with them? How do you want to bring this back to your school, to your community, to your neighborhood? And so that's where we are in the experiment.
Awesome. So going back to my bio, I forgot the most important part, which is super relevant to this. The fact that I'm also a parent of a child that will be in BPS starting next year, which gives me a lot of cred as a woman. That's like incredible, because many times we're like, I don't know, I'm a parent, I'm also a parent, but this is like, I'm a parent. And so, especially in this Family Champions workshop, that has been a great experience that I've been able to share with the other parents and really talk to them. And that has been one of the greatest kind of learnings, one of the few that we've been able to glean so far. As Kim said, we're still in the process of this first kind of pilot stage, but the connections between the parents, the connections between other people who join, like at the last workshop, 2 of the parents connected, but also one of the parents connected to somebody that works with us at Meet Boston, and really sharing of resources between neighborhoods, which really wouldn't be happening unless we were bringing these parents together. It's a pretty small group, so now that we've had 3 workshops, the parents have connected quite a bit, and are really making those connections across neighborhoods, but also from different spheres. Another thing that we've done at the last workshop, we had one of the parents present. She's amazing at community outreach, and that's what we were talking about. So she presented and really shared her experience, and that's another learning, I think, just leveraging the experience of the people who are in the workshops. Another parent is a BPS teacher, so she has a lot of experience in that. There's a parent who's a graphic designer, so just really not just imposing knowledge on them, although we're sharing resources with them as well, but also kind of learning from them and figuring out what might be best for their specific schools. Another kind of big picture thing that I just started thinking about as I was preparing for this is using this as a gateway to civic engagement. So the parents are already great connectors within their neighborhoods and their kind of communities. And here we're bringing them into Boston Saves, which is a city-run initiative, and they're connecting with us. We're bringing them into bigger kind of picture stuff. We have a presentation on scale coming up next week. All of them were invited to kind of join and kind of listen where we're going with the program next, because they're kind of the people who will be, they or we really, because I'm also BPS parent, or will be soon, where we're taking this program, and their input is super important. I'm also thinking, just in the initial stages of thinking of an advisory board for Boston Saves, another great place to plug them in, and where they could go from there is just, could be a gateway drug. Boston Saves could be a gateway drug for parents to join, be more civically engaged. And the fourth thing that kind of jumped out at me as I was thinking about it and kind of the early learnings is so the parents are really great community connectors, even more so than teachers. There's all this research, parents really trust their teachers and they're great. But I think family champions are even better connectors to their communities, because often the teachers don't necessarily live in the community and don't speak the language of the specific community or communities within a specific neighborhood. So I think these parents are plugged in even deeper and have build really trusted networks within those neighborhoods. So those are kind of the 4 that I've gleaned, but Kim might have some stuff to add.
I think that's a lot. Anyway, that's our presentation. Thank you.
We're right on time.
Yes.
Oh, you're great.
That's you. Yes. Big, massive gallop up there would be me.
I know. I think I probably don't need to. And it looks like it's on. First of all, thank you for having me up here. This is my first time at this conference. I hope it will not be the last. And I should say that the project that I'm going to talk about here is really coming from more of a personal space. I do work at Gallup. I'm a data scientist there, and I'm based out of DC. Not for much longer. I am actually moving up to Boston. Although in conversations earlier this morning, I'm maybe rethinking the timing because I'm supposed to move up in December. People are like, maybe you don't want to do that. Yeah, I need to buy a jacket first. But basically, what I wanted to do here is, working at Gallup, I have access to a rich set of data that we collect on polling that goes back a long ways, and I'm going to get to that. But I also have, at heart, a passion for open data, and Boston as a city is one of the finest examples of making that data open. And so I wanted to find a way to basically put this together, and this conference was a great way to do this. Everything, I should say, is still preliminary. I have to work on this mostly in my free time. But basically what I wanted to talk about today was citizen satisfaction, quality of life, safety, and crime over time. And I've got some co-authors that I'm working on this with. All of us are at Gallup. And so basically, what I'm interested in is using some of that open data around place. How does that relate to citizen satisfaction, which we've measured using Gallup surveys? So one would assume that there is a relationship there, but how exactly? And that's what I'm trying to identify a little more closely. So some of the data that we are using, the Boston data all comes from Analyze Boston. These are the data sets that I have used thus far. They're not the only ones. One thing you'll notice that's missing, I think pretty dramatically, is I have not included any of the economic indicators that are available yet. I'd like to pull in some of the health indicators as well, but limited time, as I'm sure everyone knows. But it includes the crime incident reports that are made available, the field interrogation and observations, which I find actually incredibly helpful and insightful, fire incident reports, hubway stations and streetlight locations. Those aren't going to play into much of the analysis right now. That's more on a geospatial piece that I'd like to get to, and then property assessment records. The Gallup data. So the Gallup data is our daily poll. It's called the G1K, or the nightly poll, the Gallup 1000. This is a poll that we've been running in the United States every night since 2008. And when I say every night, I mean almost every night. It's done at least 350 days a year. It's done on holidays. Really, the only time that it's not done is when there is a massive snowstorm in Omaha or Lincoln, Nebraska, which is where our phone bank surveyors are, and they can't get to work. And again, it's 1,000 U.S. respondents nightly, so it's not all obviously Boston or city-based, and it's also not just sort of metropolitan areas. It is rural areas as well. And I'm specifically focusing on the data from 2013 to 2017 here, partially because of sort of matching it with the Boston data makes sense, and I'm using just Boston-based zip codes. So there's roughly 2,000 respondents here in this data set. Some of the challenges and solutions around the approach, I wanted to get at those first and foremost before I show you some preliminary thoughts. Data is at various levels. So with the Gallup data, that's respondent-level data, individuals answering for themselves and their households, but it's sporadic and it's over time. There's no guarantee that of those 1,000 people called, because it's a probability-based sample, that there's going to be someone from Boston each night, much less multiple people from Boston one night. Some nights there could be like 8 people from Boston-based zip codes. Then you could go 3 days and no one. The crime, hubway, and streetlight data was all geolocated, but there's no other sort of indicators for neighborhood. So great, I've got latitude and longitude. How do I match that up with something else? And I say no zip code here because that's going to be important. It's not a measure I'm particularly happy with, but it's where I first started. And then there's the static versus fluid data over time. So property assessments happen once a year versus the crime and the field interrogation and observation, which are happening on an ongoing basis. So what made for sensible aggregations? How do you define the time frame, especially with some of that Gallup data? You can't do it nightly. You would love to, but you just can't do that. And how to define neighborhoods. So neighborhoods, for my purposes here, as at first cut, is just zip code. I'm not particularly happy with that. I think most people would say that a zip code is not a great definition of a neighborhood. And for the time frames, what I'm looking at is quarterly data. So all data has been sort of rolled up using some type of aggregation, either median or mean, depending on what made sense with the data, to the quarter. So starting in Q1 of 2013 through Q4 2017. That Boston data was merged with the Gallup respondents. And then ultimately I used some hierarchical modeling to nest zip code within time. So real quick, what do those trends look like over time? So these are some selected variables. These have been smoothed, so they look nice, but you'll get the sense. So there's measures from the various Boston data sets as well as some of the Gallup satisfaction measures. One of the things I think you'll notice is that there are variations around measures over time. The variation isn't great. If you look at the scale on the y-axis for most of these, each of these are individual, but there's not a lot of movement quarter to quarter, which is probably to be assumed. But Gallup asks a question, is this the perfect city for you? It can be answered on a 1 to 5. 5 very strongly agree. You'll see that this is starting to go up over time. However, overall satisfaction with the city is going somewhat downward. That said, not by a lot when you look at the actual scale. However, these are across all of the zip codes that I have in this data set. And for that, I think it's roughly 35 to 40 zip codes were represented. And when we break this out, I just broke this out over sort of 6 of the zip codes that had a large number of respondents in it. So these are 90-plus respondents over time. I have looked up which of these zip codes are which, but not being in Boston, I'm not great with all of them. I do still, I did it too. East Boston's represented, I think, Brighton, yes. Jamaica Plains, yeah. So I think, yes, 1, I'll learn. 2, as I looked and just did sort of cursory research, I think that this did capture a wide-ish variety of life around Boston. And some of these, okay, I have no idea what's happening with the Boston fire graph. Most of these, many of the zip codes, when you break it out, are the same, but there are some differences. You look at sort of Boston crime, the percentage of crime in the quarter that involved a shooting. There's an uptick in 02131, that zip code. And some of these others, the percent of violent crime, basically the same across all zip codes except 02128. And so that gave me some thought that maybe there is some differences around sort of this bad measure of neighborhood. And so next I wanted to just look and see, are there some types of correlations, first and foremost, between variables? This is arbitrary. I colored anything above correlation of 0.2 or below negative 0.2, green and red. Don't read too much into that. It's just to provide some separation. But you automatically, or you start to see some things that I think start to stand out. So the correlation between feeling safe in your city and race differs pretty dramatically. So white respondents said correlates positively with feeling safe. Black and Hispanic respondents correlated negatively. Some of the other ones that I wanted to point out, sort of violent crime and percentage of incidents that were violent crime and percentage that involved shooting, positively correlated. I think that's not much of a surprise. But basically, this was the first step. Seeing some of that differentiation gave me a thought that maybe there is an ability to model some differences here. And so the next step was doing some linear modeling. I used, again, a hierarchical model to basically nest space or zip code or that community within time as those measures are repeated over time. And then try to identify those relationships between the citizen voice captured on Gallup survey data and some of these open source indicators. The outcome that I'm showing here is that perception of safety. So I always feel safe in my city or area with a variety of measures. So life today is a Gallup measure saying like how good is your life today on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being awful, 10 being the best possible life. Percentage of respondents that were Black or Hispanic, percentage of violent crimes, average number of fires, and the property value. Many of these relationships will show statistical significance. However, one of the things that I think does sort of point out is that we do start to see some levels of inequality, especially around race immediately, and that other sort of measures are maybe what you would expect, that as sort of the percentage of violent crimes is increasing, your perception of safety is going down. Again, all of this is just preliminary, just to start and say, how might we be able to use sort of that rich set of data that's collected directly from citizens in a sort of probability-based way with open source indicators to identify some relationships there. So, I don't have answers. I've just raised more questions for me of how this relates to inequality. I think there's multiple ways. What can be done with that citizen voice? For me, some of my co-authors are interested more in the theory and the actual linking that to theory. For me, as data scientist, what I want to do is I want to be able to turn this into a tool. I want to make this a tool that organizations can use, that a city can use. I want to replicate this so that it's robust and can be used across cities. So for me, really is what can be done with that citizen voice. How do you get some of this data in a reasonable fashion? And I highlight reasonable because even though I work at a survey organization, I can tell you it was really hard to collect that survey data. So I was heartened to see sort of Massachusetts, Boston colleagues working on that Beacon panel. And then, are these results limited to Boston, or is there a broader sort of context here with other cities? So with that, I thank you for your time. You have a mic, right?
So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about limitations of community meetings and the kinds of political inequalities they might generate using novel data from Greater Boston. This is collaborative work with my colleague David Blick here and one of my other colleagues at the U Political Science, Max Palmer. So in response to political inequality, there's been this growing movement nationwide to encourage participation from underrepresented groups. So you've probably heard a lot about national level efforts, things like early voting, same-day registration. At the local level, we've seen movements of things like empowering neighborhood-level participation in schools and housing decision-making. Some of these studies of these movements have found unintended consequences of these policy decisions. And in particular, there's evidence that they may actually exacerbate rather than address existing political inequalities. They do this because they actually make it easier for advantaged groups to politically participate. We have really limited evidence that this might be happening at the local level, but there's been a lot less research trying to understand these political inequalities because the data at the local level are much harder to come by. And so what we want to understand is who participates at community meetings. So we do this using the case of housing policy. And we select housing policy in part because it's really substantively important. So this map shows you the change in housing prices nationally between 2000 and 2016. And you can really see just how national the increase in housing prices has been and the housing crisis is, right? So every one of those counties shaded in green has seen a price increase of at least 1.5 times. Housing policy is also a great place to look at participation in neighborhood meetings because after urban renewal, this kind of participation has been mandated in most communities nationally, including in the greater Boston area. So basically what happens is there's an accumulation of land use regulations that requires basically any housing development that features the construction of more than one unit of housing to go through multiple public meetings at a planning where members of the public can either stop or delay the construction of new housing. And so this is by design. This is what these institutions are meant to do. And it might be a really good thing if what it's doing is preventing developers from railroading local communities. But this could be a really bad thing if what it's doing is preventing or empowering an unrepresentative group of individuals. So we suspect that's exactly what's happening. So we develop a few theoretical predictions, and I'm happy to talk more about if people are interested, but we anticipate that the people who show up to these meetings are going to be really strongly predisposed to oppose the construction of new housing, and we think they're going to be demographically unrepresentative of their broader communities in sort of ways that you might expect. We anticipate they're going to be older, male, longtime residents, frequent voters, and homeowners in particular. We also think they're going to be policy experts who know the zoning code cold.
Yes.
So to look at this, Massachusetts turns out to be basically the only place in the country where you can analyze this because of open meeting laws. So what we did is we downloaded every single planning and zoning board meeting minute from 2015 to 2017. It was fun.
Define fun.
Towns in Massachusetts. And then we read them. And so what we did is we collected data from all meetings discussing the construction of more than one housing unit. So the really cool thing about Massachusetts meeting minutes is you can get the names, addresses, and addresses are super important. I'll get to that in a minute, and positions on proposed housing developments. So in some cases, these minutes are like exact transcripts. They're amazing, and so we can actually learn the reasons that people are opposing housing developments or supporting them. And so we get a total of 3,300 commenters and 4,200 comments from these data. And so this just gives you a sense of the towns from which we were able to get public comments in Massachusetts. So two things to notice from this map. First, there's obviously variability. Some of those darker blue towns are places where there are a lot more comments available. But I think the second point I really want to highlight is the demographic sort of variance of these places. So obviously it's Massachusetts. These places are whiter and richer than the country as a whole. But we also have some really socioeconomically diverse and less advantaged communities like Worcester and Lowell in our data set. So we're really able to talk about participation in a wide variety of communities. So this just gives you an example of what some of these meeting minutes look like. This is actually a best case scenario because it doesn't feature like handwritten nonsensical comments. This is from the town of Arlington. It was actually pretty easy to get data from this, but every town does it differently. So you can't scrape it. You have to just read them. It's great. So just from these meeting minutes, we can learn some really valuable information, right? So just from reading these documents, we can learn the percentage of
Okay, I don't know how I'm going to go after that. That was amazing. So we'll give it a shot. So yeah, we're going to talk about summer meals in Boston, but I just wanted to give a little bit of context for why I thought this talk would make sense at this conference. So inequality in Boston Public Schools, the entire district eats for free, so there is no question of are you free and reduced lunch or do you pay for the meal? So that's one way to sort of reduce some of the stigma around food access. And secondly, I won't have any maps or any tables or anything, but I think stories also count as data and are just as important in the interactions that you have with people. A data and design firm that we've worked with at New Urban Mechanics once said their most interesting work comes from anecdotes, and so hopefully this will be sort of illustrative of that. So City Hall and City Hall Plaza are not known for being very welcoming. They're kind of imposing. Just celebrated the 50th birthday of the building, so if you want to bring a little cupcake by City Hall, that would be great. But generally speaking, the sort of concrete, windswept plaza is not very welcoming, and that has an impact on how residents sort of perceive their city government and perceive whether or not this is a space that's for them and where they could get something that would be helpful to them. And so we wanted to understand if we could make City Hall feel more welcoming, if we could make it feel like a place where you could get the services that you want and need. The other reason we did this experiment of hosting a summer meal site at City Hall Plaza was in 2016 in the sort of government center area. There were only 2 summer meals sites in sort of a walking distance, even though there are 3 sponsors of the Summer Food Service Program, which is the federally subsidized program. So the city is one through Boston Public Schools, the Y is another, and Boys and Girls Club is the third. So there are only 2 sites within walking distance of this area, even though we know there are a lot of young people working in the area through the Summer Jobs Program, which is great, but what sort of unintended consequences are there of bringing them to jobs in this area, and then all of the lunches are very expensive in the restaurants nearby. And only one of those 2 sites was actually run by the city, and it was only open 1 day a week. So is that really access, and is that really the kind of helpful service that we're trying to provide to young people? And so we asked, as we do in New Urban Mechanics, we like to ask questions. If you join the registration table a little bit later, we'll have our first civic research agenda, which is full of 68 pages worth of questions. But we wanted to know, is there actually such a thing as a free lunch? And if there is, what would your perception be as a person walking by City Hall, a young person maybe working in the area, or an even younger person coming by with your family to take care of some sort of civic chore? What would it mean for you to be offered by your city government a free meal? And how would that impact your willingness to engage with us in other ways? So from July 5th to August 25th, we wheeled this fridge out through the security machine at City Hall every day. At 10:30, we received meals from our vendor, and then at 11:30, we opened up and we started serving to kids 18 and under. So part of the reason that there's no data per se in this talk is the program actually doesn't allow you to collect data. So all you can do is take a tally of the number of children who come by. You can't ask them for identification. You can't take down any information about them. And so I can tell you that we served 1,058 meals over the course of the 7 or so weeks, but that's about all I can tell you in terms of numbers. So we wheeled this out. We were out 2 hours a day, and we just had different activities that kids could engage with. The older kids, we sort of thought that they might want to get their meal and then go sit down and maybe chat with one another, but maybe the younger kids would want to sort of stay and participate in some sort of programming with us. And we wanted to make the meal sort of the secondary thing so that it wasn't drawing attention to the fact that you were accessing a free meal, but rather there was some sort of interesting programming, and then, oh, look, you get to have a lunch and enjoy a sunny day at City Hall Plaza. The sort of fridge art was from a group of 4th graders from the Gardner Pilot Academy who came to visit us, and we asked their help in spreading the message about the program to their peers and what would be effective to them, and they sent us back this art. So we put it up for the last week of the program, which was really fun. We had other art opportunities, asking people what a good summer day looks like. We also had a lot of partnerships, which were really key. So we were able to work with the BPDA to bring out their huge model from a storage closet somewhere. So I imagine most people had never seen it. And we put it right on the plaza, or sort of up in the plaza, and had families engaging and interacting with the model and then coming to get a lunch. We also worked with MassDOT Safe Routes to Schools to engage families and young people about different alternatives to, or different ways to get to school and what they perceive as safe. And we had a lunch on the lawn day, or a story on the lawn, the cover photo from this section was our partnership with Read Boston. We had like 60, I don't know, maybe kindergarten age kids. They came, they did a song, they got a free book, they were read a story, and they got their meal, and it was really cute. And a lot of adults walking by sort of reacted really positively and surprised. Like, what are all these kids doing here? This is so nice. I would love to see this more. And so it was a good sort of reminder to us that when you can sort of shake people out of their normal expectations of a space, that can have some meaningful impact as well. We brought down some learning opportunities, so we had some VR headsets. So this kid was learning how to play drums from one of the Boston artists in residence, who was teaching a group of folks at a community center different drumming techniques, and so this kid was sort of drumming along with the video. And for those of you who are Boston locals, you may know Keytar Bear. We got his help advertising the program, so that was a highlight for me of the summer. And I would say we learned a lot of things. I think the sort of title, Unforeseen Challenges, I mean, there were a lot of tensions around sort of who we were serving and who we weren't. So the program is for kids 18 and under, but there were a lot of people who were over 18 who came by the site, sometimes just to ask questions about it, sometimes to ask about how they could implement it in their city or town, which was lovely. I had a lot of school teachers come up saying, oh, I've never even heard of this program. Can we do it? It is a federally funded program, so any city and town can do it. And so I had a lot of interest from those folks. But on the other side of things, we certainly talked to a lot of people who were clearly food insecure or were expressing some sort of interest in getting some food, and we weren't able to serve them, had to turn them away. And so that was really tough. And what does it mean when you're trying to provide access to something, but you have to say, but not for you? And so when folks would come, when families would come with their kids to pay a parking ticket or pick up a birth certificate, a lot of them thought it was really nice to be able to get a lunch for their kid and then sit down and sort of turn it into an afternoon. But for some folks who were coming up without kids or who sort of hadn't heard of the program before, it sort of rubbed them the wrong way that we weren't, we were standing here, but we weren't going to give them food. There's also a veterans shelter nearby City Hall, if you're familiar with the area, and we had some veterans come by and ask if they could have a meal, and we weren't able to serve them either. And so that was really tough. And we had a number of summer fellows who were helping us staff the site, and I think we all shared that experience of just sort of the heaviness of trying to do a good thing, but then also what comes along with that. There's also really interesting weirdness around under-ordering and over-ordering. So with the sponsor that we had, you had to place your order 3 days in advance, and you had no idea how many kids were going to come by. So you might put in an order for 50 meals and then have only 20 kids show up. So I think we only ran out 2 days, which is good, but which one is better? Running out of food, so great, kids are coming by and you're serving the food, but then you have to turn away a kid because there are no meals left, versus over-ordering and then saying, okay, once this food is past its like servable date, which is 2 days past the day you receive it, what do you do with that? And by the program sort of rules, you're supposed to throw it away. But we couldn't handle that, so we gave it to the veterans shelter nearby, even though that probably wasn't per rules, so I know this is being recorded, but we thought that that was the right thing to do, and so we did it. And that only happened a couple times as well, but still, this tension of under versus over ordering. We had a lot of repeat customers, so what does that say about the need for access to food in the area? There was a set of siblings who would come with their grandmother every day. And it was really great to see them all the time, but then you also think, okay, but what does that mean if they're coming by every day? Or maybe it's just that they're coming by every day and it's nice, and don't make assumptions. We had one young girl who came with an adult, I'm not sure what the relationship was, and at the end of about a week of coming, she brought 2 gardenias from her garden and shared it with us and said that we were such a wonderful part of her week in Boston, which was really nice. And finally, I think a sort of strangeness of the program is you're required to eat on site. And so for City Hall Plaza, what does that mean? How far does that go? What are the sight lines? And so you're supposed to do your best, put in your best effort to make sure that the child or the young person receiving the meal knows that, but how far does that go? So if I say to you, hey, you have to eat this on site, and you say to me, yeah, okay, and then you walk away and sit down, and then I see you leave like 12 seconds later, what do I do about that? Do I go chase you down and say, give me that food back? No. So there's sort of an interesting tension around, it is a free lunch, but I'm gonna make you sit here, and is that really what is helpful to you? We had a woman who's waiting for the ride, and she had some young kids with her, and she asked if she could get them for the kids and then take it with her in the ride because they had to go back to wherever they were coming from, and I had to say no, and so that was really tough. But there were some great stories like the gardenia and the siblings who were wonderful. There were so many times where people from the same neighborhood or same parts of town would show up. They were there to do some sort of civic chore at City Hall. They would stop by, grab a meal for their kids, sit down, and realize that they were neighbors and start talking. And that was just really nice to be able to provide that space for people to come together and engage around a nice thing at City Hall. We also got to engage a lot of City Hall staff, which was really wonderful. Again, I mentioned the sort of young kids first story on the lawn, but people just sort of coming in and out of City Hall every day as they do were asking questions, were interested in why we were doing this, what we were hoping to achieve. So it was really nice to be able to engage City Hall staff as well. And then I think for next year, so we did this in partnership with the Office of Food Access, and they were also running a site at the Mattapan branch of the Boston Public Library. And so for this summer, City Hall will be a site again, as well as the bowling building, the BPS headquarters. So we've expanded and trying to understand what happens when municipally owned buildings provide another service beyond just the sort of thing that they're ostensibly there for. And they're expanding their library program to 3 additional sites beyond the Mattapan branch library. So we're expanding from sort of the 2 sites with that OFA was responsible for to 6. And we're also hiring some young people to run the sites, so that will be cool as well.